doing ancient Greek and Roman studies, linguistics, that kind of thing. Um, the older it is, as long as we have language, the more interesting. So, I am these days the managing director of the Save Ancient Studies Alliance, and I also run my own YouTube channel and Twitch channel, which are under the name Zilla's Athenaeum. You can find me all over the place at Zillable, syllable but with a Z. Um, and a lot of what I do is archaeogaming stuff, particularly looking at, if you heard me talk yesterday, a lot of games that are not in the sort of AAA, you know, take a sword and figure out how to kill it sort of genres. So, one thing that has been particularly of interest to me lately is the way that video games treat antiquity within them, treat the remains of their own past. So, uh, thus, does it belong in a museum? And I'm going to take a look specifically at the difference between the way that Roots of Pacha treats its antiquity and the way that Stardew Valley, which is probably the most popular farm life sim, short of Harvest Moon, treats its artifacts history. So one thing that I kind of need to contextualize here is when we have ruins, ancient physical buildings and remnants as a gameplay space. Because we do have some very, very different ways of interacting with this kind of quest. And typically, like when you think of going through ancient ruins, and I have some images here from a really wide array of games, I think, but this is, just a smatter, just a taste of the kind of things you might see. Like in Tomb Raider, you're obviously going through an ancient space, ruined buildings that are long out of use from a culture that is gone. And um, the the same thing kind of happens in the newer Zelda games, right? You have these ancient columns that I've taken a picture of here, or you might find a forgotten temple that are remnants of in this case, a civilization 10,000 years old. Um, but then you might also have things that are more sort of flavor and like you might even need to destroy pieces of them to get through, like in Spelunky, where you find levels that are extremely Egyptian or extremely Mayan, and you have to deal with monsters coming out and barriers to your progress that are part of the landscape. So the typical way that games will interact with ruins of antiquity is not so much as a site of learning, but as a site of almost obstacle, right? You're having to just get around things, blow things up, find new ways through, loot for artifacts if you're tomb raiding. Um, and if you're lucky, maybe you have a Zelda character, like in Breath of the Wild, who is interested in the history of that particular civilization on the side. Um, which kind of brings us to how we do treat antiquity as sort of an object of study in gaming, which brings us to museums. Because the typical way that we interact with antiquity that we can imagine as a study is through a museum, is presented to us in this curated fashion rather than in situ. So I've grabbed just a smattering again of games that have museums as gameplay spaces and how we interact with those. So in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, you have your own little museum area, and one of the first things that you see in the game is this desecrated museum of your own, where objects have been flung around haphazardly. Maybe something has been stolen. Um, but museums have this air of respectability, right? This air of reverence. And like I use the word desecrate pretty intentionally here because it's not just this feeling when in Indiana Jones, when you go into the museum, it's not just this like, oh man, somebody wrecked my room. It's also this like, oh my God, who would do this to these priceless artifacts? Like there's a sense of violation in addition to the act of robbery. And I think, a pretty fun twist on that is the gallery experience, which if you haven't seen, I highly recommend. Is hilarious and wonderful. You have a meter just for how much cheese you've eaten at this museum gallery opening. Um, but they take real like images, highly pixelated images of real museum artifacts that you can click on, and they take you to all of the information about them. Um, and and you have it through the lens of Doom Guy, this very quintessential, you know, early FPS shoot 'em up violence perspective. But all you're doing is wandering. And so the intrusion of Doom Guy into a museum holding his wine glass by the stem like he's going to crush it, um, is transgressive in that same way as seeing the broken museum in Jones. And I wanted to contrast this with the museum in Animal Crossing New Horizons, specifically because this is my favorite museum in any. If this were a real museum, I would go to it like 100 times. Um, the Animal Crossings Museum is a gorgeous space. It's incredibly welcoming. It's fairly realistic, and each section is built to accommodate the specific thing that it's showing off, and it feels like a celebration of knowledge in a way that ideally museums would. So museums as a gameplay space, we can use them to elevate that sense of sacred belonging, of being allowed into the realm of knowledge, or we can use it to create this feeling of deep violation of bringing violence into a sacred realm. And I just want those images in your head as we move to what games actually tend to do with their real artifact, with their artifacts that you find in game, and with the ruins that you find in. So let's talk about artifacts first. So the things that might wind up in a museum. So we have here some artifacts from some very different games. I did bring in Stardew Valley. Pardon me. So you have just one of the artifacts that you might dig up. It's an ancient doll. And you have a little description. And this is very common. When you find an artifact, you can take it to a curator and get some knowledge about that artifact. So here, once you take an artifact to the museum's curator, Gunther, you get this description: an ancient doll covered in grime, doll may be used as a toy, a decoration, or a prop in some kind of ritual. That's a fun little nod to archaeology's tendency to go, we don't know what it is, so ritual object. So every item that you can put in the museum in Stardew Valley will get a little description. Be like this. You don't ever have to read, despite the fact that you can, in fact, fill up the entire museum, that you get an achievement for filling the entire museum. There are a finite number of artifacts in the game. They each have their own unique item descriptions. Some of them have history, some of them have jokes that even nod towards sort of an archaeological understanding of the world. But it's very solid. And then I want to talk artifacts in Tomb Raider. I have probably a whole paper's worth of rant in me about the artifacts in Tomb Raider. So as you see this lovely Oni mask. I think my text might be a bit blurry, but again, you have this sort of artifact description. You are playing as Lara Croft, archaeology grad student with a specialty in ancient Japan. Um, in This is Tomb Raider 2013, so it's the darker, grittier reboot. Um, and again, you get this sort of like, oh, this is kind of item, and you get a description of it, and you have your expert, in your head telling you all about this item, like its date, its usage. Um, but then you click off and she pockets the item and never talks. It's just a collectible. She puts it in her backpack instead of leaving it where it is or even documenting where it was. She doesn't put it back in the case that she found it in because she always finds them in cases. Uh, Cases are not of interest to her. The situation she finds them in is barely of interest to her. Like, this is an ancient Japanese artifact and in an ancient Japanese ruin. But sometimes she'll find other things from other eras, and she'll treat them with the exact same, uh, oh, I know a little about this, I know a little about time period, and I'm going to shove it in my pocket. Um, so that's, a pet peeve of mine with that game. And so instead of having any sort of place to put that, it just kind of goes in your theoretical inventory, the hammer space of game. And then I wanted to talk about Heaven's Vault because Heaven's Vault is one of those rare games that actually is coming from a more realistic archaeological perspective and has some nuance to how it treats the artifacts, but if you're not paying attention, you might not notice exactly how odd it is. So here is our main character, Aaliyah, who is one of the few historians in the nebula, holding a robe that is several hundred years old. Some reverence. In the story, she is astonished by this item. She's examining it very closely and treating it gently. And she has found it in the context of somebody else, another sort of historian, deliberately concealing it. So she's examining for why. And she's found some writing on it that she's trying to read, and that's always her perspective. She's an epigrapher primarily, and a linguist. And so you sort of try to decipher where and you keep the robe, and you do this with every artifact you find. And every artifact that Aaliyah finds, she has choices. She can hang on to it in her personal collection. She can trade it away to the curators in the university, and if she does that, she and anyone else will never see it again. They take it away and hide it from us. They study it, but nobody gets access to that. She can bring it to a trader on in her home world, which is much more sort of it's a poor area, and there's a lot of is everything strictly above board here? You know, you can give it to a trader and say, hey, I'm looking for this kind of object, but I have this to offer you. And so you can trade in antiquities, literal antiquities dug up from around the nebula, which is a real thing that happens, of course. The antiquities market is thriving on the gray market and the black market to this day. All you have to do is look at Hobby Lobby to hear more about that one. But also, like, most of our museums are full of artifacts that are of unknown provenance, or you kind of squint sideways at it and you're like, yeah, this was looted from a country that was in the middle of a war, or like all that kind of story happens constantly. Toppy, the person you trade with, is more of a private collector's source, but you have the feeling that that's where it is. And then, of course, there is no money in this nebula. So if you want to buy a piece free, you might have to offer an ancient coin, a silver dagger, something that you found that might be of interest to some. And so the artifacts are barter objects, and you have to make this decision of how much any given thing is worth to you. To come back around to Stardew Valley, I mentioned that there are a finite number of objects you can. Well, that's not strictly true. There are just a finite number of types of objects you can dig up 10 ancient dolls, but after the first one, there is no more room in the museum. So what do you do with them? Mostly put them in the bin to sell, just like they were an egg potato. So I want to talk a little bit about farm life sims, the genre that I'm looking at today, and kind of give you some context for that, and how museums sort of are integral to that image. So farm life sims is, at least for now, the name of the sort of subgenre of like slice of life games where you move into a space and slowly develop a little town or a little you know, little homestead or whatever. And usually you have some element of farming, some element of people interpersonal relationships, some element of building and crafting. It's very much in the direction of cozy game, of things that people associate with more relaxed environments. And the sort of model for this genre comes from the Harvest Moon games, which are a Japanese series that are very, you know, you start out, you move into this village, you take up an old farm, you turn it into, your life is dictated by growing crops and selling them, but you also interact with people in your village. You eventually romance somebody, you can life and have a marriage and a child, and the weather changes and the date changes, and over time things happen, and that's kind of the idea of them. And Stardew Valley, I wanted to use particularly because, its creator, Concerned Ape, is very much somebody who grew up on Harvest Moon and basically took the nostalgic feeling of what did it feel like to play Harvest Moon and how do I make that into a real because of course one of the things that we do run into is that older games were working with much fewer much less data in terms of what worked and much more limited technology. So we can present Stardew Valley as single developer with as many content patches as Bored Ape continues to put out. There was one this year. I guess it took last. Anyway, within the last year, there's the whole new update with new content. It's still to this game that is 10 years old. So it's got this feeling of living a nice, peaceful life. It's very in line with the pastoral feelings that you get from something like, you know, Virgil or Horace's poetry about the countryside. This view of life out on the farm and away from the bustle of the city and the corruption of politics and all that jazz. It does, interestingly, allow for a lot of experimentation at the fringes of what does it mean to have a cozy country life. You get things like Bloomtown, which have a much darker side to them once you start to settle in. You of course get a lot of twists and turns on the genre, and there are different things that people want out of these games. One of the things that is fairly consistent in these games is there's almost always some kind of museum. almost always some kind of digging up artifacts, building a collection, interacting with the community in the view of its past. So, like I was saying about Stardew's artifacts, which is fairly typical, there's only a certain number of unique items, and after you've built your collection in the museum and the museum has it all up for display, well, what do you do with that? Just toss it in the bin. And that is often the way of things, of selling duplicates. And this is, a little bit troubling to those of us who have connections to real-world archaeology, because artifacts are important, and prevalence of particular types of artifacts is data, and everything we can learn about our past is precious. But if you're going to dig up another fossil in Animal Crossing, and you already have all your fossils, what are you going to do with that? The only real option is to sell it. So there's this attitude that I think it's not like it started with Indiana Jones, but I think it very much has got codified by the phrase from Indiana Jones of that belongs in a museum. But when you are dealing with artifacts that you dig up in a game, at a certain point, it doesn't belong in a museum anymore. And then there's the question of, if you're digging up these artifacts constantly, is a museum the best way to deal with it? So here I wanted to show off the Stardew Valley sort of its case. Here is a completed museum collection over on the right side of the slide. So as you can see there, that is the complete set of artifacts and gemstones that you can find. And there's a subset. This is nicely organized. Most of it is gemstones, stones of various types. You have one shelf of paleontological finds, ancient cage, ancient scapula, an ancient hand, a fossilized hand. And then you have two shelves here of artifacts, mostly artifacts, some from humans and some not. And each of the items, like I said, has its little historical context that you get from the museum's curator, Gunther. And so down at the bottom here, I've got an image of Gunther, and he's explaining to you why he needs your help to repopulate the museum. He says, this is embarrassing, but the previous curator made off with the entire collection. We don't have any artifacts to display. Can you imagine? Can you imagine this being anywhere near possible in our world, where unique artifacts are constant? They would be so recognizable, right? You'd have to melt down that gold mask in order to get anything of it. However, in this world where there are only so many types of artifacts and they do get sold regularly on the market, of course this can. So that's really telling us quite a lot about our attitude towards artifacts before you've even dug any, because this is the first time you talked. And one thing that I do really want to get into is the history of Stardew Valley that these artifacts are telling us is way more interesting than the game tends to talk about. So I've given you a couple of pieces here of your interactions with the history of Stardew Valley. So first, I want to talk about the townsfolk. So all of the townsfolk are humans, and they live a fairly straightforward life in terms of, like, they interact with other humans. As far as you know, they don't talk to any of the other races. You never see any of the other races on the surface. You have to go out of your way. you do get to know them. You know, they know about the wizard. They know about the wizard, but they don't really interact with him. They call him that strange man who lives in the forest. Um, so, so first of all, your interaction with the artifacts, of course, is they're just a collectible, right? There's only so much you can do with that. The library and the museum, which are one building that Gunther manages, are important to the town as educational centers. And I don't want to downplay how important that is. That's why I have the screenshot of Penny here saying we're very lucky to have a library in such a small, because there really are only about 30 people in this game. And that small of a town probably wouldn't have a very good library, let alone a museum with that many artifacts. So the educational value of bringing the past to light, of bringing the natural world into a museum, of having someone like Gunther who can explore those things, I don't want to undersell that, because that is very important. And museums as a concept have been incredibly important in especially parts of our modern culture where we otherwise don't get that kind of connection to it. But Stardew Valley's roots go much deeper, and I've hinted at there are other races, and I want you to look at what I have. Wizard here is starting to say, the two of you must peace for the sake of the humans that live around you. Who is he talking to? He's talking to a shadow person and a dwarf. So the history of Stardew Valley that you can read if you pay attention to the artifact descriptions, if you pay attention to some very few cutscenes like this, a few things that you can read if you go out of your way. A long time ago, so long that we don't even really know the age, there was a civilization of elves. And we know almost nothing about them. And they are completely missing from the game except for a couple of artifacts you can do. Then, the shadow people, who still live here, who have lived here for a long time, colonized the underground, and like they live in the under. That's where they are. And the dwarves came from the sky. Their name means sky people in this game. And so the game, if you read the book about it, theorizes that they were actually from another planet that had a much thicker atmosphere. And so they can't survive under our sun. So they moved into, and this is where I meant to use the word colonize, they colonized the underground and had a war with the shadow people called the Elemental Wars. And none of the humans, except for the wizard, seem to know about this. The wizard is there talking to a dwarf and a shadow person who've gotten into an argument because their parents fought in the Elemental Wars. And the wizard is saying the Elemental Wars are over and they have to stay over because otherwise you will disrupt the peace of the humans. None of this history seems to be common knowledge, even though it was only a generation ago the wars ended. I find it so fascinating that there's such a deep history and almost no connection to it. And this is where I want to start talking about the Roots of Pacha. So Roots of Pacha is similarly a farm life sim. I've heard it called Stone Age Start. I think that's a pretty apt description. In this game, your plan has been called by the spirits to this new place, and you are settling in. You're building technologies like, hey, we could actually like domesticate some plants and maybe some animals. That would be neat. Like, I wonder if we could make cheese. Like that's the level we're at in terms of like the gameplay. That's where the technology advances are. But here we again run across an ancient ruin almost immediately. And this ruin is not an obstacle. It's not something to be looted. You never pick up artifacts from it. Preserve it, yes, in situ. And the whole plot of the game revolves around this discovery. Already in this past, we have an ancient past to deal with. And that ancient past is affecting the present. It can't be relegated to the sidelines like in Stardew Valley. Um, Spoilers, I suppose, for the game, but I want you to see some of the storytelling here where Vuok is interpreting the paintings that are on this room. And so he's saying Pacha, the great tree spirit, Mother Earth, essentially, is sad because her children, the sun and the moon, have gotten in an argument and stopped talking to each other. The spoiler is that this is part of the present plot. This is a big part of the present plot. So the sun and the moon here are not abstract concepts. They are tribes of different peoples who have had an argument. They used to be one people. And you throughout the course of the game are working to bring them together again. At the beginning of the game, you meet these two tribes, the Mograni and the Yakuans. The Yakuans think that the Mograni are, snarling, fanged beasts who throw children in fires to eat them. And the Mograni think the Yakuans are tentacled horrors who want to drag you into the ocean. It turns out they're all just people. The Roots of Pacha are a sacred space, and they are treated as such. Much like a museum, taking something away from here would feel like a violation, and they never do. So when you go into the ruins, the sort of main ruin, you can see at the bottom here. If I go back to the previous slide, you can see the top of that ruin is that purple one there. So that space is a temple, and they find it. They know that either their ancestors or some other people's ancestors, it turns out to be, in fact, their ancestors, built this space as a temple, and it stays that way. They preserve it. They clear enough that things will not decay, and they continue to use it as a storytelling space, as a space of contemplation of the past and trying to understand that past. When you find other ruins, like this bear carving in the cave, which is actually huge. I don't know if you can see the character there, but it's about the size of one of the claws. Those places are, again, considered sacred. They don't take anything away. In fact, you add to it. You continue to use it in the way that it was presented. So I want to talk now, the sort of end of my presentation. I hope I haven't run too far over time, but I want to talk about connection between the Roots of Pacha view of antiquity, of the past, of ruins, and the indigenous view of the past and archaeology. So right at the beginning of Roots of Pacha, you get, like every time you boot up the game, you get this game is a work of fiction designed to evoke the feeling of human prehistory in a hypothetical setting. The depictions in this game are not meant to represent any specific culture, geography, or time period. And I want you to keep that in mind because it would be so easy to have made this about real indigenous First Peoples, right? To try and make this a specific Aboriginal space. And they don't. Instead, what they do is they take elements of many First Nations and try to integrate those values into a connection to a shared past. So here I have an image of Shrug Island, the Awakening, of the oral storytelling that you find there. There are other Shrug Island, the Awakening is specifically about Indigenous Australian points of view. There are other games that I thought about pulling from that have different particular cultural origins in First Nations. There's Never Alone is, I believe, Inupiaq, and there's I wanted actually to think about potentially some of the games set in Mesoamerica that have, some Mayan origins. There are a lot of these, and there are more every day. But I wanted that to look here at how they use storytelling in Roots of Pacha. It's always oral storytelling with this, kind of cave painting like visuals that go with the story. And that's how they talk about the past. That's how they talk about sort of metaphorical pasts. That's how they talk about the Mograni and the Yakuans coming together. That's how they talk about the spirits and what they represent to them. So their folklore is all in this oral storytelling, and that is a very traditional way in many indigenous cultures of interacting with the past. You pass on the stories of your lineage. I don't have a ton of time to talk about repatriation here, but I do want to emphasize how closely this is connected to that indigenous notion of the past of every, right? So in Pacha we have this oral storytelling, this continued in situ worship, and respect for the context in which the artifact is found, the context in which a ruin is found, the treatment of a space not as a modern sightseeing, but as, oh, this was a sacred space and it still is. Because despite all of our arguments, we are all human and we do all have a shared past. And that is something that I am interested in seeing more games take advantage of. So I'm going to wrap up here. Hopefully there's still a little time for questions. And I did want to just, so here's where you can find me, but also some basic resources that I was looking into in trying to look at the indigenous view of sacred spaces, of antiquity, and of oral storytelling. Highly recommend Archaeologies of the Heart. Thank you to my archaeogaming friends for pointing this one out to me, which is a collection of essays on of papers on how to approach archaeology in ways that are respectful and incorporate different traditions than the very Western, very, put it in museum mindset. And I do highly recommend that to everyone. And if you're more into video storytelling, there is a great lecture that I found by Andre Bouchard. So I hope you enjoy, and I am ready for questions if you are. Thank you so much.
Hello, it's me. I'm back. Again, I'm Chelsea. I'm part of the Hit Points of History team. I actually do have a question.
Yeah.
So I love Stardew Valley and I love games that like setup. And I find this talk so interesting because I oftentimes like wasn't often thinking about like moving through the game thinking about like I contributing to a museum. I've often thought about those sorts of um, museum type places in these games as like this is a way for us to explain the story to the player and like um how do I say it? Like it's almost like it's to me it doesn't read as always like a museum where you're collecting ancient artifacts. It reads like you're collecting one of everything in the game, which feels um odd. But in particular with sorry, now that's being how you read. But in particular with Stardew Valley, one thing that I will say that's kind of frustrating is when you have all of these things that you can find multiple times because there's like two things that you can only find once or like are so rare in the game that you kind of forget that you shouldn't just sell them when you find them. Anyway, but that's getting off the rails. But I know you said that Animal Crossing is your favorite in-game museum, but in terms of like the experience of gathering items, is there a game that you enjoyed that aspect in most? And like the story that they take you on, or is there one that you feel like is more like authentic of an experience than others?
I think I have to come back to Heaven's Vault for that. That game, while it is imperfect, it feels very real in the way that each artifact, each find is unique. And there you can find as many of them basically as you have time for within the but these artifacts are so the process of gaining new artifacts and learning more about the past in Heaven's Vault is absolutely fascinating. And then you come across the problem of where do they go? Right? So while I love the Animal Crossing Museum, you are, of course, I dug a thing up out of the ground. I managed to make a deal with this unsavory trader for an actual real Venus de Milo or whatever. Like it's the actual real thing, and there can be more than one of the real thing. And it's it's such an odd dichotomy of like, am I gathering artifacts that feel real in the real way, that feel like I'm interacting with the ancient world, or am I collecting game items to fill a collection? Because of course you do get, you get an achievement for filling the museum in Stardew Valley. Like that's exactly my problem. I mean, a problem is maybe the wrong word, but like it's such an interesting tension. I don't think that I've ever encountered a game where you both have that collection aspect for the past in a satisfying way, and you get to just, have them in a context where there's not a huge amount of problematic interaction on the other end. And like I said, I don't want to discount something like the Stardew Valley museums or any museum's value in terms of education, but at the same time, like I just put an elven bracelet from who knows how long next to a fossilized hand and a chunk of mudstone. Like there's something weird. Like you said, it doesn't feel like you're interacting with the past unless you really go out of your way. Sorry, I hope that answered your question.
No, that's great. Thank you. I think we probably have time for probably 2 more questions before we break for lunch. I'm going to move out of the way of this square. So just walk right up to the square. And yeah, move to the side.
Julie, thank you. That was awesome. I have a recommendation for you, and then I have a question.
Yeah.
My recommendation is a game by the Arcane Kids from 2010s. It was called Bubsy Goes to the James Turrell Retrospect.
Oh, I haven't heard of this one. That's
You're gonna
fast.
love it. You're gonna love it.
I'll write that down.
You can't miss it. Bubsy Goes to the James Turrell Retrospect. It's incredible. My question for you is, there's a mechanic. I'm guessing it comes from Resident Evil. It's this like picking something up and like revolving it.
Yeah,
We used it in LA Noir for like
right.
evidence. I was wondering. I didn't play the new Indiana Jones game, but I was wondering if you've seen examples of that kind of way of interacting with artifacts in a video game setting that you found to be particularly interesting in this kind of video game museum sensibility.
Yeah. So I do want to touch on the Tomb Raider 2013 again there, because it does very much in the exact same way that Resident Evil does it. You know, you have this object and you can rotate it, and you have all the data about it here on this big blank black space. And I love that you can rotate the object, that it's a fully modeled artifact, and you can see the inside of it, and you can see the backside of a piece of pottery. But again, like my my sticking point is then you just shove it in your pocket. So in terms of a game curation in that direction, so I didn't personally play Indiana Jones. I've seen some gameplay of it, and really it was more in that direction of, you know, shove it in your pocket to keep it from the Nazis, which I can understand. You know, like I can understand that better than Lara Croft slinking around Yamatai with a no mask in her. But let's see, it's an interesting sort of mechanic, because like, you know, we were talking, Megan was talking yesterday about getting to see the B sides of vases, right? And these are meant to be 3D objects, and that's so unusual in game spaces. You're usually seeing one angle of a thing. I keep thinking about this browser game by Inkle Studios called Forever Labyrinth, which I played last summer, and it is somewhere between a museum and roguelike. You are entering webs of meaning through these museum objects, and you do only get to see one side of things. They're usually 2D pieces, not always, but they're mostly 2D pieces. But again, you get the real information from Google Scholar, I think it is, and you can go very easily to the information and see the other images of it that exist. And you're getting multiple views of it, both a distance and a close up, and you get all this information about the artist and also about like the associations that a particular piece has, like because it's webs of association. You know, you might have a room of paintings that all include mustaches. And if you go from there and you're looking for something like, oh, I'm looking for all paintings, I'm looking for a room of lakes, and one of the mustache paintings is a guy with a mustache sitting on the edge of a lake, and you can make that pretty directly. And I think that's a very interesting way of presenting not necessarily the physical multiple sides of an artifact, but the way that we chain associations. I don't know if that was quite exactly what you were looking for, but that's what came to mind.
Can you repeat the name of the game?
That's the Forever Labyrinth, and it is a browser game, so it's free to play, and you can just start it on any computer.
Very cool. I pulled it up just now. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Julie. So yeah, this is something I spent a lot of time thinking about, characterizations of museums and artifacts in games. And um, there are, as you've rightly pointed out, some games that do it better than others. Some, I mean, they're designed for different things. And so one of the things I often think about, and the kind of game at this moment, of course, I'm blanking, but you know how there's like a specific genre of game where like there is a museum within the world, but then there's that specific trope of like you need to break in and like steal an artifact,
Yes.
but not because you're like a tomb robber or like a museum robber, but it's like I literally cannot remember what it's called because I've only seen gameplay of it online, but there's that like World War II game where you're like going around during World War II in Berlin, and they're like, they need you to break into the museum and steal artifacts back, like away from the Nazis. While that brand of game, like, I understand why they want to make these types of games, it is very conflicting for me because I'm like, yes, but you're still advocating for like breaking into museums and stealing artifacts, and you know who knows where they'll end up. I wanted to get your thoughts on, you know, what kind of, I don't want to say damage, but also the kind of damage, you know, does that do to our perception of museums and how we should treat things? Because I think it's really easy to have this tendency to say like, oh yeah, but we're stealing it for something, so ergo it's bad. But you know,
Right. Yeah. No, I'm like I mentioned with the Indiana Jones gameplay, you're pocketing ancient artifacts that the Nazis have to keep it from the Nazis. And like that is the like prototypical I'm doing this bad thing for a good reason, right? And like it just for some reason it keeps coming back to Indiana Jones, but the public perception of how to treat artifacts and ruins really does shape how artifacts and ruins get treated in the real world. And like we have now that there are so many games where you can go and just take artifacts and be like, found a collectible, go me. There are people who do that. Like this is an increasing problem in the real world of people treating artifacts and ruins like collectibles and obstacle courses, the way that we do in games. And it's something that I think we need to be aware of, both as historians and archaeologists, but also as game designers. And I didn't end up having time because I could talk about this forever. I didn't end up having time to talk about the issue of repatriation, but right now in the museum world, there is a huge debate raging about all of those artifacts that come from elsewhere and what do we owe in return? What needs to be repatriated? Like if you're not quite sure what I'm talking about, go look up the Parthenon marbles. This is like the quintessential case of we have these objects in the British Museum that British Lord Elgin just went and took from Greek Acropolis. He just took them. Yeah, I'm simplifying. I see that. Like I am simplifying for the sake of narrative, but like they've been in the British Museum now for generations. They're a mainstay of the British Museum, and they are famous and popular and educational. They're important items, and Greece wants them returned. And that question is not a simple one, right? These items have value where they are, but there's a good case for returning them where they would have just as much value and more proper situation in terms of in situ. So it's such a big question of, you know, how can we balance the need for, you know, realistic or engaging gameplay with the real world consequences of treating artifacts and ruins with this kind of game mindset.
Yeah. No, I know the time is quickly expiring, but I asked this because it was kind of sort of a two-part thought, because there was that, because in this context of, can there be an ethical kind of recapturing of something if we think it's good? Only because I've learned not too long ago that there was like an author who wrote a book, and he was not confident that anyone would read his like memoir. So what he did is he amassed, I think he was pretty wealthy, but what he did is he buried some treasure. I swear it's in like Idaho or well, in one of those random states. And he
Right.
like put the clues in the book, in his book, to find it. Right. And so this can seem like a really innocent type of, treasure hunty type of thing. So many people heard about this treasure, right? That they go and they read this book looking for clues. And I've heard people have sort of fallen off cliffs, gotten eaten by bears. So they like died looking for this ridiculous treasure. Right. So in the context of, is there anything good, and then we hear about things like that. That's really where this two-parter was going, was like, is any instance where like, this is a good idea, even if it's seemingly harmless.
Right. And so I do have a foot in the puzzle community. And this is sort of again, in the puzzlers community, which is its whole own world, there is this conundrum of, we would really love to go on a real world treasure hunt, and sometimes people make them. But when you do that in the real world, the rest of the world keeps moving, including factors like erosion, bears, construction sites, all that kind of stuff. And so you really have to be very careful and put a lot of safety and limitations on how you structure things in order to keep people safe. And if you aren't doing that, or if people aren't thinking about it, you run into lots of issues. Thanks, Lexi. I think you're muted.
Darn. That's all that so smoothly. Thank you all so much. We're going to wrap for lunch. So we'll be back at 1 p.m. Central Time. So the next top of the hour for work.